At some point, you made a decision. You probably don't remember making it because you were very young and it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like survival. You decided which parts of yourself were acceptable and you buried the rest. The anger that made people uncomfortable, the ambition that seemed like too much, the sensitivity that invited cruelty, the wildness that didn't fit. One by one, carefully and without ceremony, you took the pieces of yourself that caused problems and you put them somewhere you didn't have to look at them. And then you built a life on top. Jung spent his career trying to tell people what that costs, not in the obvious ways, the deeper cost, the one underneath all of those, the cost of living your entire life as a performance of yourself rather than as yourself. The shadow is not your darkness. It is everything you were told was dark. And until you go back for it, you will never know who you actually are. I'm David. Welcome to our channel. Let's take this journey together. You were not born knowing which parts of yourself were acceptable. You learned. The way all children learn, through repetition, reward, and the particular pain of watching someone you love withdraw their warmth because of something you did or said or felt. You were praised when you were agreeable. You were managed when you were difficult. You were loved most consistently when you were easiest to love. And so, with the pragmatism that children apply to survival, you began editing. Not consciously, not with any understanding of what you were doing or what it would cost you. You simply noticed over and over which version of you produced safety and which version produced something else. Tension, disappointment, the particular silence that means you have done something wrong. And you adjusted. You became, gradually and completely, the version that worked. The anger went first for most people. Anger in a child is inconvenient, disruptive, frightening to adults who haven't dealt with their own. So it gets managed, told to go away, told it's ugly, told it makes you difficult to love. The child who learns this lesson doesn't stop feeling angry. They learn to feel angry quietly, internally, in ways that don't disturb anyone else. And then, over time, they learn to not feel it at all, or so they believe. Then the ambition. If you grew up in an environment where wanting too much was dangerous, where standing out invited criticism, where success in the family meant threatening someone else's sense of themselves, you learned to want quietly, to shrink your desires to a size that didn't make anyone uncomfortable, to call it modesty, to call it not being greedy, to build, without ever quite naming it, a ceiling on what you were allowed to want. Then whatever else needed to go. The sexuality that was called sinful, the creativity that was called impractical, the grief that was called self-pity, the joy that was too loud, the sadness that was too much, the opinions that were too strong, the presence that was too large for the particular room you grew up in. Piece by piece, year by year, until what remained was a self that fit. Jung called this the persona, the mask constructed for public consumption, the version assembled from the expectations and requirements of everyone around you. And he was precise about something that most people find difficult to accept. The persona is not your enemy. It is necessary. You cannot move through a social world without some version of it. The question is not whether you have a mask. The question is whether you know you're wearing one. Most people don't. The mask gets put on so early, worn so consistently, reinforced so thoroughly by every interaction that confirms its value, that it stops feeling like a mask. It starts feeling like a face, and the self underneath it, the one that was edited out, starts feeling like a stranger. Jung called the edited out self the shadow, not the evil self, not the dangerous self, not the self that needs to be kept away from polite society for everyone's protection. The shadow is simply everything that couldn't come to the surface. Everything the persona had to exclude to function. Everything real about you that wasn't convenient. And here is the thing that most introductions to this concept fail to convey with sufficient weight. The shadow is not a metaphor. Jung did not mean it as a poetic device or a useful way of thinking about personality. He meant it structurally, as a genuinely active component of the psyche, present, energized, organized, and operating on your life with a consistency and intelligence that your conscious self rarely matches. The shadow does not wait patiently in the dark for you to come and collect it. It is not dormant. It is not neutralized by being ignored. It grows. Jung was precise about this. The more consistently a part of the self is repressed, the more pressure it accumulates, the more force it eventually exerts. The things you have spent the most energy keeping down are the things that have the most energy available when they finally find a way out. And they always find a way out. The shadow makes itself known in projection. The trait you most harshly judge in other people is almost always a trait you have buried in yourself. The person who cannot tolerate arrogance in others has usually buried their own hunger to be seen and recognized. The hunger that was once called selfish or showing off or thinking too much of yourself. The person who judges selfishness with particular intensity has usually buried a self whose needs were never allowed to exist openly. The person with a violent contempt for weakness has usually buried a vulnerability so thoroughly that they can no longer access it in themselves, and seeing it in others is intolerable because it touches something they have worked very hard to not touch. You are not seeing them clearly in those moments. You are seeing yourself from a distance, in a form you haven't yet acknowledged. The reaction is disproportionate precisely because it is not really about them. The shadow makes itself known in the patterns you cannot break. The relationship that keeps taking the same shape despite your conscious intentions to do it differently this time. The self-sabotage that arrives precisely when something good is within reach. When you are closest to the thing you say you want, and something in you finds a way to undermine it. The anger that erupts disproportionately over something minor, that bewilders you afterwards, that you apologize for with a sincerity that doesn't prevent it from happening again. Because it isn't really about that thing. It is about everything that thing touched, everything that has been waiting, pressurized, for somewhere to go. The shadow makes itself known in the exhaustion, the particular tiredness that isn't about sleep, the sense of going through the motions of a life that is correct on paper, but hollow in the living of it. The smile that you put on, and the part of you that watches yourself putting it on, and wonders, distantly, when this became normal. When did performing become the default? When did the gap between the inside and the outside become so wide that you stopped noticing it? Jung was not being poetic when he described the shadow's power. He was being structural. A psyche that is divided against itself, that is using significant energy to keep parts of itself suppressed, is a psyche running at a deficit. The energy required to maintain the performance, to keep the buried parts buried, to manage the moments when they try to surface, to monitor every interaction for the risk of the wrong thing emerging. That energy is not available for anything else. For creation, for genuine connection, for the kind of presence that makes a person feel fully alive rather than adequately functional. You are not tired because life is hard. You are tired because you are carrying two selves, the one you show and the one you suppress, and the weight of that maintenance is constant and invisible, and it never stops. Here is the thing about the self you buried that nobody explains clearly. You didn't bury it because it was wrong. You buried it because someone, at some point, needed you to. The anger wasn't dangerous. The anger was inconvenient for someone who didn't want to examine what they were doing, that made you angry. The ambition wasn't selfish. The ambition was threatening to someone who had made their peace with wanting less. The sensitivity wasn't weakness. The sensitivity was uncomfortable for people who had learned to protect themselves by feeling less. You made someone else's problem your own. You internalized their discomfort with your reality as evidence that your reality was the problem. You edited yourself not because you needed editing, but because you were a child. And children will almost always choose belonging over wholeness when forced to choose. That is not a character flaw. That is the most human thing there is. But you are not a child anymore. And the editing that kept you safe in that environment is costing you something significant in this one. The suppressed anger that protected a relationship with a parent who couldn't handle it is now preventing you from setting limits in relationships that require them. The buried ambition that kept the peace in a family that was threatened by it is now the ceiling you keep hitting without understanding why it's there. The conditions that made the burial necessary no longer exist. What exists now is the burial itself, still operating, still shaping your choices, still drawing the boundaries of what you allow yourself to be, based on a negotiation you made before you had the capacity to understand what you were agreeing to. Jung described this as one of the most costly aspects of the unlived life. Not the life you didn't live because of external circumstances. The life you didn't live because of the internal ones. The self-imposed limits. The quietly maintained boundaries on what you were allowed to want, feel, say, become. The cage that was built from the outside and is now maintained entirely from within. The confrontation with the shadow is not a dramatic event. It does not arrive with ceremony. It arrives in the small moments of honesty that most people immediately smooth over. The flash of anger you feel and immediately apologize for before anyone has even reacted. The desire that surfaces and gets dismissed before it has time to be examined. The thought you notice yourself having, and then notice yourself deciding not to be the kind of person who has that thought. The moment of genuine feeling that gets converted in real time into something more manageable, something that won't cause disruption, won't require explanation, won't ask anything of anyone. These are the moments, each one a small point of contact between the surface self and the buried one, each one an opportunity that most people, most of the time, decline. The reason most people decline is not laziness, and it is not cowardice in any simple sense. It is that the shadow, when you first turn toward it, does not look like a part of yourself you lost. It looks like a threat. The anger feels dangerous, because you were taught it was dangerous, because you saw what happened when it surfaced, because you learned that the cost of expressing it was a cost you couldn't afford. The grief feels bottomless, because if you let yourself feel it properly, you don't know where it ends. The desire feels shameful, because someone, somewhere, successfully attached shame to it, and that attachment has survived everything you have otherwise outgrown. So the first encounter with the shadow is rarely comfortable. Jung never pretended otherwise. He described the confrontation with the shadow as one of the most psychologically demanding experiences available to a person. Not because the shadow is monstrous, but because what it requires is the revision of a story you have been telling and living for a very long time. To look at the shadow is to admit that the performance is not the whole picture, that the person you have presented to the world, to the people you love, to yourself, is a selected version, and that the selection was not neutral. It was made under pressure, in the service of someone else's comfort, at a cost you are still paying. But here is what Jung also understood, and what gets lost in the discomfort of the first encounter. The shadow is not what you fear it is. The anger is not going to destroy everything if you acknowledge it. The grief is not going to consume you if you let it exist. The desire is not going to make you into someone unrecognizable. These things were assigned their terror by people who were themselves afraid of them, and you inherited the fear along with everything else. When people actually turn toward the parts of themselves they have been avoiding, the most common experience is not horror, it is recognition, a sense of, oh, there you are. I remember you. I remember what it felt like before I decided you were the problem. The shadow is asking you to become someone complete, to stop performing a partial version of yourself and start inhabiting the full one. Not the edited self, not the self that was acceptable, the one that was always there, underneath, waiting with a patience that has outlasted everything you have used to suppress it. What happens when you stop suppressing it is not what most people expect. It is not a liberation that announces itself loudly. It is not a dramatic transformation that everyone around you immediately notices and names. It is quieter and more specific than that. The changes are interior first and behavioral gradually. You begin to notice that certain things no longer have the hold on you they once did. The criticism that used to destabilize you for days lands differently, not because you've stopped caring about what people think, but because you're no longer holding up a fragile construction that depends on everyone's approval to remain standing. You know what's underneath now. You have looked at it. The criticism cannot reach what it used to reach, because what it used to reach is no longer the only thing there. The patterns begin to shift, not immediately, not completely, not without returning to old shapes when you are tired or under pressure or caught off guard. But they shift, because the shadow was driving them, the suppressed anger finding its outlet in the wrong places, the buried need expressing itself through the wrong relationships, the unacknowledged desire pulling you toward things that approximated what you actually wanted without quite being it. And when the shadow is no longer suppressed, when it is acknowledged and integrated rather than managed and denied, it no longer needs to find those indirect roots. It can simply be what it is, in you, present, known. The relationships change too, not all of them, and not always in the direction you would choose. Some people in your life are invested in the edited version of you, not maliciously. They simply built their relationship with the performance, and when the performance becomes less reliable, they become uncertain. Some will find their way to the real version and discover they prefer it. Others will find that what they valued was the convenience of the mask, and when the mask becomes less available, so does their interest. Jung described this as one of the inevitable costs of individuation, the process of becoming the particular person you actually are. It is a cost worth paying, but it is a real cost, and people who were not warned about it sometimes interpret the relational disruption as evidence that the process is going wrong. It is not evidence of that. It is evidence of it going right. The person who emerges from genuine engagement with the shadow is not a more difficult person. They are a more real one, less available for performance, less willing to smile when they don't mean it, to agree when they don't, to be whatever the room needs them to be at the expense of whatever they actually are, more present in the moments they choose to be present in, more genuinely warm in the relationships that are genuinely worth warmth, more able to be known, because they know themselves. And being known requires that. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming, across a lifetime, the particular person you actually are. Not the person assembled from other people's requirements, not the person who fit the room you grew up in, not the person who learned, very early and very effectively, which parts of themselves were worth keeping and which were better buried. The person who was there before the burial, whole, unedited, difficult in the best sense, present in a way that makes demands, real in a way that doesn't accommodate pretense, alive in a way that can't be mistaken for adequate. That person has been waiting. They are not lost. They are not damaged beyond recognition by the years of suppression. They are simply buried. And the distance between where you are and where they are is not as far as it looks from the surface. It is exactly as far as the courage required to stop smoothing over the small moments of honesty, to let the flash of anger exist long enough to be heard rather than immediately apologized away, to let the desire be examined rather than dismissed, to ask, not what is wrong with me for feeling this, but what is this feeling trying to tell me that I haven't been willing to hear? That is the excavation, not a single dramatic act, a series of small ones, repeated over time in the direction of yourself. You have been carrying the weight of the burial for a very long time. Not the weight of the buried things themselves, those were never the problem. The weight of the constant management of them, the energy required to keep the lid on, to maintain the performance, to be reliably the version of yourself that everyone has agreed to accept. That weight is not an external condition. It is not the result of your circumstances or your relationships or the demands of your life. It is the result of a decision you made before you knew you were making it. A decision that made complete sense at the time and that you have simply never revisited. Jung's invitation, and it is an invitation, not an instruction, is to revisit it, not to become someone unrecognizable, not to destroy what you have built, but to stop paying the price of a negotiation you never consciously entered. The self you buried is not lost. It does not expire. It does not become less itself from being suppressed. It has been waiting, with a patience that should frankly unsettle you, for you to come back for it, go back for it. Not all at once, not without discomfort, not with the expectation that the people around you will necessarily welcome what emerges. Some will, the ones who actually know you, who have loved you rather than the performance, will recognize it. They will say, there you are. The others will say you've changed, and they will be right. If something in this landed, write it in the comments. One sentence. What it named. That is the beginning of the excavation. Thanks for listening, and I hope you've gained something from our time together. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. This helps us to continue to keep making great content for you. Take care as always.